The realtor's perfectly manicured hand gestured toward the crown molding while her voice dripped with rehearsed enthusiasm. This Pearl District townhouse represents Portland's finest historic architecture, fully renovated with original 1920s details preserved throughout all 3 floors. My stepmother Diane stood beside her wearing that cream-colored Chanel knockoff she'd bought with money stolen from my mother's jewelry fund, and when the realtor quoted the price, $850,000, Diane laughed. That sharp, dismissive sound I'd learned to hate over 13 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oh Nicole, she said, loud enough for the other prospective buyers to hear, my stepdaughter couldn't possibly afford something like this. She works in computers or something. You know how these young people are, all coffee shops and student loans. Maybe show her some condos in Gresham instead? The other viewers, a young couple and an older gentleman in expensive shoes, glanced at me with that mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment that makes your skin crawl. The realtor, Nicole Brennan according to her business card, shifted uncomfortably and opened her mouth to redirect the conversation. But what none of them knew, what Diane especially didn't know, was that I'd already been pre-approved for the full amount. What they couldn't see was the cashier's check in my purse for the entire purchase price. And what Diane would never understand was that this house, this specific 3-story townhouse with the turret windows and the garden courtyard, had been my mother's dream before cancer took her when I was 11. My name is Claire Hartford, and at 27 years old, I'd spent the last 8 years building a career in software project management that had taken me from Seattle's tech scene back home to Portland. I had a good job managing cloud infrastructure projects for a growing SaaS company, a modest studio apartment in southeast Portland that I'd furnished from thrift stores and IKEA, and enough financial discipline to have saved aggressively since graduating college. But more than that, I had my mother's trust fund, the one my father's sister Valerie had helped me protect from Diane's grasping fingers since I was 14. Diane had married my father Richard when I was barely past middle school, sweeping into our Beaverton suburban home with her 2 suitcases of designer labels and a smile that never reached her eyes. Within 6 months, she'd redecorated every room to erase my mother's presence, convinced my father to refinance the house she'd helped pay for, and begun the slow process of making me feel like an unwelcome guest in my own childhood home. Now she stood in my mother's dream house, trying to humiliate me in front of strangers, and something inside me that had been carefully restrained for over a decade finally snapped into perfect, cold clarity. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and opened my banking app where the transfer had already been confirmed that morning. Nicole, I said, my voice steady in a way it had never been around Diane before, I'd like to make an offer. Full asking price, all cash, no contingencies, close in 2 weeks. The room went silent. Diane's laugh died mid-sound. And that was just the beginning. I should explain how I ended up at that open house in the first place, standing in a room that smelled of fresh paint and furniture polish, about to make the biggest financial move of my life. The path there started 3 weeks earlier with a phone call I almost didn't answer. My father's name had flashed on my screen during a Tuesday afternoon project meeting, and I'd let it go to voicemail like I usually did. Our relationship had become transactional over the years, brief check-ins on holidays and birthdays, surface-level conversations that never touched on why I'd moved to Seattle for college and stayed away for 6 years after graduating. But he called back immediately, which he never did, so I excused myself from the conference room and answered. Claire, we need to talk about something important. Can you come to dinner this weekend? His voice had that tight quality it got when Diane was in the room, probably listening. I'd learned to read those subtle shifts, the way he modulated his tone based on her proximity, how he'd become a different person depending on whether she could hear him. I have plans, I lied reflexively, the same defense mechanism I developed at 16 when declining invitations meant avoiding Diane's subtle digs about my weight, my clothes, my choice of college major, my friends she deemed unsuitable. It's about your future, he pressed. About the family. About making sure you're taken care of. The words sounded scripted, like he'd practiced them, and my stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. Nothing good ever came from Diane's version of being taken care of. Against my better judgment, I agreed to lunch instead, neutral territory, a bistro in downtown Portland where witnesses and ambient noise would buffer whatever conversation they'd planned. That Saturday, I showed up 15 minutes early and ordered coffee, giving myself time to rehearse polite deflections and plan an exit strategy. They arrived together, Diane's hand possessively on my father's arm, her highlighted hair swept up in a style too young for her 48 years. The small talk lasted exactly 7 minutes before Diane leaned forward with that conspiratorial smile she used when delivering bad news disguised as concern. "Claire, honey, your father and I have been discussing your living situation. That tiny studio you're renting, it's just so impractical for someone your age. You should be building equity, investing in property." My father nodded along like a dashboard bobblehead, and I felt that old familiar tightness in my chest, the sense of being managed, manipulated, pushed towards something I couldn't yet see. "We found the perfect solution," Diane continued. "There's a condo development going up in Gresham, very affordable, and your father could co-sign so you'd get a better interest rate. It would be a family investment. We'd all have a stake in your success." Translation, I thought, they want access to my finances, want their names on my property, want control over another piece of my life. I'd spent years learning Diane's language, how she wrapped demands in the vocabulary of care, how she made her invasions sound like gifts. "I don't need help," I said carefully. "I'm doing fine on my own." "Oh sweetie," Diane's smile sharpened. "We know you think you're doing well with your little tech job, but real financial security requires family support." The condescension in little tech job made my jaw clench. My little tech job paid me $115,000 a year plus equity and benefits. My little tech job had earned me 2 promotions in 3 years and respect from colleagues twice my age. But Diane had always been skilled at diminishing my accomplishments while praising her own online boutique that never seemed to turn a profit despite constant infusions of my father's money. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in the Gresham condos." I kept my voice level, professional, the tone I used in difficult client meetings when I needed to establish boundaries without burning bridges. My father's face flickered with something that might have been relief or disappointment, I could never tell anymore. Diane's expression hardened just slightly, that micro-adjustment around her eyes that signaled I'd failed to comply with her script. "Well," she said, setting down her mimosa with deliberate care, "we just want what's best for you. But if you're determined to throw away this opportunity, that's your choice. I suppose some people need to learn from their mistakes." The conversation shifted then to safer topics, my father asking about work projects I couldn't discuss due to confidentiality agreements, Diane mentioning her boutique's latest inventory challenges as if running a perpetually failing online store was equivalent to managing million-dollar software implementations. I left that lunch with my defenses intact but my curiosity activated. Why now? Why the sudden interest in my housing situation after years of minimal contact? Diane never made moves without multiple motives layered like those Russian nesting dolls, each one hiding something smaller and sharper inside. That evening, I called my Aunt Valerie, my father's older sister who'd been my ally since my mother died, the one person in the family who'd never fallen under Diane's influence. Valerie owned a commercial real estate brokerage and had an insider's understanding of property deals and financial maneuvering. She also had zero patience for Diane's manipulations, which had made family gatherings tense until Valerie simply stopped attending them. When I explained the lunch conversation, she went quiet for a long moment before saying something that made my blood run cold. "Claire, I need you to check your credit report. Tonight. All 3 bureaus. And then we need to meet." I pulled my credit reports within the hour, sitting at my small kitchen table with my laptop, watching the pages load with growing dread. There it was, buried in the details. A credit card I'd never opened, showing a balance of $18,000. An auto loan for a Lexus I'd never driven. A personal loan from a predatory lender I'd never contacted. All of them opened within the last 2 years, all using my social security number and an address in Beaverton I hadn't lived at since leaving for college. My hands shook as I scrolled through the fraudulent accounts. The addresses listed were my father's house, where Diane had access to any mail that arrived in my name. The phone numbers went to numbers I didn't recognize. The email addresses were variations of my name that I'd never created. Someone had built an entire shadow financial life using my identity, and the most logical suspect was the woman who just suggested I let my father co-sign a mortgage, giving her access to even more of my financial information. Valerie met me the next morning at Riverside Grounds, a coffee shop in the Alberta Arts District far from anywhere Diane would venture. My aunt arrived with a leather portfolio and the grim expression of someone about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. Before I could speak, she slid a folder across the table. "I've been doing some research since your call. This is bigger than identity theft, Claire. This is systematic fraud, and your father is either complicit or criminally negligent." Inside the folder were financial records Valerie had obtained through her professional networks and what I suspected were some legally questionable methods. Bank statements showing transfers from my father's accounts to the fraudulent credit cards in my name. Property records indicating he'd taken out a second mortgage on the Beaverton house. Tax documents that didn't match his declared income. Business registration papers for Diane's boutique showing my name listed as a silent partner in a company I'd never agreed to join. "How long has this been happening?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Valerie flipped through pages with the efficiency of someone who'd already memorized the contents. "Based on what I can prove, at least 4 years. Probably longer, but the earlier records are harder to access. The boutique registration is from 6 months after Diane married your father. She's been using your identity to shield assets, build credit she then destroys, and create paper trails that implicate you in her business failures." The coffee in my cup had gone cold while I processed this information. My stepmother hadn't just been emotionally manipulative and socially cruel. She'd been committing federal crimes using my identity, with my father's knowledge and financial support. Every snide comment about my little tech job, every suggestion that I wasn't financially competent, every attempt to insert herself into my banking and housing decisions, had been moves in a longer game of exploitation. What do I do? The question felt inadequate for the magnitude of the situation. Valerie's expression shifted from grim to something harder, more determined. "First, we document everything. Then we freeze your credit, dispute the fraudulent accounts, and file a police report. And Claire," she leaned forward, "you need to prepare yourself for the fact that your father chose to help her do this to you. This isn't just Diane being Diane. Rick signed documents. He transferred money. He knew." The detective assigned to my case was a woman named Angela Reeves, mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of my high school calculus teacher. She sat across from me in a small interview room at the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Division, reviewing the folder Valerie had compiled with occasional nods and notes in the margins. "This is comprehensive work," she said finally. "Your aunt missed her calling as an investigator." Valerie had insisted on coming with me, sitting beside me like a protective barrier against the institutional indifference I'd feared. Detective Reeves walked us through what would happen next. The investigation process, the likelihood of prosecution, the timeline for disputing fraudulent accounts, and the uncomfortable reality that family members committing financial crimes often faced lighter consequences than strangers would. "Your father's cooperation will determine how this proceeds," she explained. "If he claims he didn't know what his wife was doing, if he can show he was also a victim, the district attorney might offer a deal." "But he did know," I said, thinking of those bank transfers, his signature on documents, the way he'd avoided my calls for months at a time when I tried to maintain contact. "He helped her." Reeves nodded slowly. "Then we build a case that reflects that. But I need you to understand something, Claire. This will get ugly. Family fraud cases always do. There will be people who take their side, who say you're being vindictive, who suggest you could have just handled this privately. I'm prepared for that," I said, though I wasn't sure I was. Valerie squeezed my hand under the table. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned the language of fraud investigation. Affidavits and credit disputes, police reports and forensic accounting, the labyrinth of bureaucracy required to prove that someone you shared DNA with had systematically robbed you. I hired an attorney, Thomas Nguyen, who specialized in identity theft cases and had a reputation for aggressive prosecution. He took one look at Valerie's documentation and said we had enough for both criminal and civil cases. Thomas was methodical in a way that felt reassuring. He didn't offer false comfort or promise quick resolutions. Instead, he laid out a strategy that would take months, possibly years, but would ultimately untangle every thread of Diane's fraud. We filed disputes with all 3 credit bureaus. We contacted every fraudulent creditor with cease and desist letters. We built a timeline of transactions that painted a damning picture of premeditated theft. During all of this, Diane and my father went silent. No more phone calls suggesting family investments. No more lunch invitations with hidden agendas. Just an eerie quiet that felt more threatening than their previous interference. Valerie warned me they were likely consulting their own lawyers, preparing defenses, possibly moving assets to protect themselves from what was coming. The silence meant they knew they'd been caught. Then, 3 weeks into the investigation, Valerie called me with news that shifted everything. "Claire, you need to sit down for this. I'm sending you a listing link. Just open it and look." The link led to a real estate website featuring a stunning 3-story townhouse in the Pearl District. Historic Victorian architecture with modern updates, rooftop terrace, original hardwood floors throughout, chef's kitchen with Italian marble countertops. The price tag was $850,000. I stared at the photos trying to understand why Valerie was showing me properties far beyond what I'd been looking at. "Look at the second photo," she said. I scrolled to an image of the front facade, the distinctive turret windows and the carved wooden door, and my breath caught. This was the house. The one my mother had fallen in love with during one of our weekend drives through Portland when I was 9 or 10. She'd slow down every time we passed it, pointing out the architectural details she adored, the way the morning light hit the windows, how she could imagine us living there someday when things were more stable financially. "Mom's house," I whispered. Valerie's voice was tight with emotion. "It went on the market yesterday. Claire," I ran the numbers. "With your trust fund, your savings, and a small mortgage, you could actually afford this. More than afford it. You could buy it outright and still have reserves." I closed my laptop, my mind spinning with possibilities. This wasn't just any property investment. This was reclaiming a dream Diane had spent 13 years trying to erase. My mother had died before she could ever own that house. She'd spent her last months in hospital rooms and hospice care, never getting to walk through those doors as anything but a wistful admirer. But I could do it. I could make her dream real, transform it into something Diane could never touch or diminish or steal. The idea took root immediately, growing from impulse into determination with the force of 13 years of suppressed grief and rage. I called Nicole Brennan, the listing agent, that same afternoon. Her voice was professionally warm as she described the property's features, the recent renovations that had preserved the historic character while updating electrical and plumbing, the competitive market that meant serious buyers needed to move quickly. "I'd like to see it as soon as possible," I told her. She had an opening the following Saturday, an open house from 1 to 4. "Perfect," I said, already planning. What I didn't tell Nicole was that I'd already secured financing approval. My bank, a credit union where I'd maintained accounts since college, had reviewed my financial history and offered terms that would have made conventional lenders weep with envy. But I didn't want a mortgage. I wanted the power of a cash offer, the kind that eliminated contingencies and closed fast. I wanted to walk into that house and know that nothing stood between me and ownership except signatures and wire transfers. Valerie helped me coordinate with a financial advisor named Carol Martinez who specialized in large asset liquidation. Carol was a pragmatist who didn't ask unnecessary questions about why a 27-year-old wanted to liquidate conservative investments for a single property purchase. She simply ran the numbers, confirmed the strategy was sound, and began the process of converting stocks and bonds into liquid capital. Within 4 days, I had access to enough cash to purchase the townhouse outright with money left over for furnishing and repairs. The night before the open house, I barely slept. My studio apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with accumulated memories of every time I'd made myself small to avoid Diane's criticism. I thought about my mother, about the way she'd light up when we drove past that house, how she'd describe which room would be mine, where she'd put her reading chair, how the garden courtyard could hold summer dinner parties. She'd never been materialistic, but that house represented something more than property to her. It represented stability, beauty, a future that cancer had stolen before she could grasp it. Saturday arrived with typical Portland drizzle, the kind of soft rain that feels more like atmosphere than weather. I dressed carefully in clothes that split the difference between approachable and successful. Dark jeans, a tailored blazer, minimal jewelry. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in that price range without seeming like I was trying too hard. Valerie offered to come with me for support, but I declined. This was something I needed to do alone, at least initially. The Pearl District on a Saturday afternoon hummed with the energy of young professionals and established wealth coexisting in renovated warehouses and historic buildings. I parked 2 blocks away, giving myself time to walk and settle my nerves. The townhouse looked even better in person than in photos. The brick facade glowed warm even under gray skies, and the turret windows reflected clouds like promises of sky-high views. Nicole stood in the foyer greeting prospective buyers, her professional smile genuine as she handed out property information packets. I introduced myself, accepted the glossy folder, and began touring the first floor. The living room featured a fireplace with original tile work. The dining room had built-in cabinets with leaded glass doors. The kitchen blended vintage charm with modern appliances, exactly the kind of thoughtful renovation my mother would have appreciated. Every room felt right, felt like coming home to a place I'd never actually lived. Other buyers circulated through the space, a young couple arguing quietly about whether they could afford the property taxes, an older man in expensive casual wear who examined crown molding with the critical eye of someone who'd owned many houses. I was studying the built-in bookshelves in what the listing called a library nook when I heard her voice. That distinctive pitch that had narrated my teenage years with criticism disguised as concern. "Nicole, darling, what a gorgeous property." Diane swept in wearing that cream knockoff Chanel suit, her arm linked through my father's. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes scanning the room with the wariness of someone expecting ambush. I froze, my back to them, processing the astronomical odds of this encounter. Then again, maybe it wasn't coincidence. Valerie had mentioned the listing was getting significant attention. Perhaps Diane, always attuned to status symbols and investment opportunities, had marked this property for herself. I turned slowly, making eye contact across the room. My father's face went pale. Diane's expression flickered through surprise, annoyance, and then that calculated sweetness she deployed like a weapon. "Claire, what a surprise. Are you here with friends?" Her implication was clear. Surely I wasn't here as a serious buyer. Surely someone like me, with my little tech job and my studio apartment, was just touring for entertainment or accompanying someone with actual purchasing power. "I'm here to view the property," I said evenly. Nicole, who'd been observing this exchange with growing confusion, smiled professionally. "Are you familiar with each other?" "She's my stepdaughter," Diane said, the word dripping with performative affection. "We were just talking about her housing situation recently. Young people today have such a hard time getting started in this market." The condescension landed exactly as she'd intended, designed to diminish me in front of the agent and other buyers who'd paused to watch our interaction. Nicole maintained her professional composure despite the awkward family dynamics suddenly filling her open house. She began describing the property's features, pointing out the recent roof replacement and updated HVAC system, the permits all properly filed for the renovations. Diane nodded along as if she were the intended audience, occasionally making approving sounds about the Italian marble or the original woodwork. Then Nicole mentioned the price. $850,000, which reflects the premium location and the quality of renovations while remaining competitive for the neighborhood. Diane's laugh cut through the room like breaking glass. "Oh Nicole," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "my stepdaughter couldn't possibly afford something like this. She works in computers or something. You know how these young people are, all coffee shops and student loans. Maybe show her some condos in Gresham instead?" The young couple glanced at me with pity. The older gentleman raised his eyebrows. My father stared at the floor as if the hardwood might open and swallow him. Nicole opened her mouth to redirect, but I was already reaching into my purse. The cashier's check was in a leather portfolio, prepared that morning at my credit union. I pulled it out along with my pre-approval letter and set both on the marble kitchen counter where everyone could see them. "Nicole," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional, "I'd like to make an offer. Full asking price, all cash, no contingencies. I can close in 2 weeks." The room went completely silent. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. Nicole's eyes widened as she looked at the cashier's check, at the amount clearly visible, at the bank letterhead confirming my liquid assets. Diane's face went through a remarkable series of expressions. Shock, disbelief, fury, and then a desperate attempt to reclaim control of the narrative. "Claire, where did you get that kind of money?" Her voice had lost its sweetness, replaced by something sharper and more accusatory. "Did you take a loan? Because if you're overextending yourself just to prove some point, your father and I can't bail you out when it goes wrong." I met her eyes directly, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Not through the filter of childhood dependence or teenage fear or young adult anxiety, but with the clarity of someone who'd finally stopped accepting her version of reality. "The money came from my mother," I said. "The trust fund she set up before she died. The one you've spent 13 years trying to access. Also from my salary at my tech job that pays me 6 figures annually. And from careful financial planning while you were opening credit cards in my name and destroying my credit for your failing boutique." My father's head snapped up. The color drained completely from Diane's face. Nicole and the other buyers had gone very still, sensing they'd stumbled into something far more dramatic than a typical open house. "I don't know what you're talking about," Diane said, but her voice had lost its conviction. "You're clearly confused, probably stressed from work. Maybe we should discuss this privately." "We'll discuss it in court," I said. "Detective Reeves from the Financial Crimes Division has all the documentation. Bank transfers, forged signatures, fraudulent accounts. 18,000 on credit cards I never opened. A Lexus I never drove. A business partnership I never agreed to. All using my social security number and your address." My father finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Claire, we can explain." "No," I cut him off. "You can explain to the district attorney. You can explain to the judge. You can explain to whoever will listen while you're being prosecuted for identity theft and fraud. But you don't get to explain to me anymore. I'm done listening to explanations that are really just excuses for choosing her over your own daughter." Diane grabbed my father's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "This is ridiculous. She's being hysterical. Rick, tell her she's being hysterical." But my father wouldn't look at her. He stared at me instead, and for the first time in 13 years I saw something that might have been remorse or shame or the belated recognition of what he'd sacrificed for a woman who was now going to drag him down with her. Nicole cleared her throat, professional training kicking in despite the chaos. "Miss Hartford, perhaps we should step into the other room to discuss your offer?" I followed her into what had been labeled as a home office, leaving Diane and my father standing in the kitchen with an audience of strangers who'd just witnessed a family implosion. Nicole closed the door and took a breath before speaking. "I apologize for that situation. I had no idea there was family conflict." "Neither did I said, which was only partly true. I knew about the fraud. I didn't know they'd be here." She nodded, pulling out her tablet to begin processing the offer. "Your financials are solid. Cash offers close fast. If the sellers are motivated, we could potentially close in 10 days. I thought about my mother, about 13 years of Diane's manipulation, about the freedom that came with finally fighting back. Let's aim for 10 days then." The paperwork took an hour. Nicole explained every document, every signature required, the inspection waiver I was accepting by making an as-is offer, the title company that would handle closing. When we finished, she walked me to the door past Diane and my father who'd moved to the front room. Diane tried one more time. "Claire, you're making a mistake. This is too much house for someone like you. You'll be drowning in maintenance costs and property taxes." "Someone like me," I repeated. "You mean someone whose identity you stole?" Someone whose mother's memory you tried to erase? Someone who actually earned their money instead of stealing it? I opened the front door, rain misting against my face. This house was my mother's dream. She used to drive past it and imagine living here. She died before she could make that happen. But I'm going to make it happen for her. And you're never going to step foot inside it. 9 days later, I stood in that same foyer with keys in my hand and my name on the deed. Valerie had brought champagne. Thomas and Gwyn had brought the final documentation showing Diane and my father were both facing criminal charges. Carol Martinez had brought a portfolio showing my remaining investments, still healthy despite the large purchase. We toasted in the empty living room, our voices echoing off hardwood floors that would soon hold furniture chosen by me, for me, in a home that represented everything Diane had tried to take and failed to destroy. The criminal trial would take months. The credit repair would take longer. But standing in my mother's dream house that was now my house, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Diane entered our lives. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet. But the solid foundation on which happiness could eventually be built. The first floor would be my living space. The second floor would house a home office and guest rooms for Valerie and the few friends who'd stood by me. The third floor, the one with the turret windows and the view of downtown Portland, would be my sanctuary. A library and reading room filled with my mother's books that I'd kept in storage for years, waiting for a place worthy of displaying them. My phone buzzed with a text from Valerie. The support group wants to meet next week. 3 other people dealing with family fraud. Interested? I looked around the empty house, at the crown molding and the original fixtures and the space that would become home. Yes, I typed back. I'm interested. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who'd been diminished by someone who should have protected them. Every daughter or son who'd been told they weren't good enough while being actively sabotaged. Every victim of family fraud who'd been made to feel crazy for suspecting the truth. 6 months later, the house was furnished and the support group had grown to 12 members. We called ourselves the Fresh Start Collective, meeting monthly in my first floor living room to share resources and strategies for rebuilding after family financial abuse. Diane had taken a plea deal, 5 years with possibility of parole. My father had cooperated with prosecutors and received probation plus restitution payments he'd be making for the rest of his life. I'd been interviewed by local news about family fraud, speaking publicly about something most victims kept hidden out of shame. Standing on my 3rd floor balcony one evening, watching the sun set over Portland, I thought about the girl I'd been at 14 when Diane first arrived. How small I'd made myself, how quiet, how apologizing for existing had become my default mode. That girl wouldn't recognize the woman I'd become. The one who'd paid cash for her mother's dream house and turned it into something more than just property. A home, yes, but also proof that the people who tried to break you don't get the final word. You do. And sometimes that word is simply no. No more access. No more excuses. No more making myself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. Just no, spoken clearly, backed by action, and built into the foundation of a life reclaimed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.